I'm Quinn. I'm a research associate here at the Blanco Center, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our ninth Lunch and Learn for Whole Health Louisiana. Whole Health Louisiana is a collaborative effort with the Louisiana Department of Health as the public sector anchor for the Whole Health Louisiana initiative. And the Blanco Center leads the plan's implementation and evaluation. If you're unfamiliar with what Whole Health Louisiana is, Whole Health Louisiana is the state's cross-sector initiative intended to systematically address, mitigate, and prevent childhood adversity within our systems of care and support. Whole Health Louisiana has four priority areas and goals: collaboration, collaboration, awareness, workforce, and prevention and healing. With these priorities in mind, Whole Health Louisiana's vision is to build a state where children, families, and community members across Louisiana are healthy and thriving, regardless of who they are or where they live. Um, excuse me. As part of this initiative, we are holding a variety of different activities meant to raise awareness and deepen conversations about trauma-informed care practices. Our virtual Lunch and Learn series touches on the workforce priority area of the Whole Health Louisiana Plan and features presentations from industry professionals and subject matter experts. We have a webinar planned for one Thursday of each month, all throughout the summer and throughout December. Each webinar will touch on various topics related to the goals and objectives of Whole Health Louisiana. Our planned webinars are listed on the Eventbrite page that you all use to register for today's event. So keep an eye out for that as we update it with all our upcoming speakers and topics. Before I introduce the speaker for today, I want to first mention our ASL interpreter today is pinned on the Zoom call. So you should see her pinned to your screen to view the interpretation throughout. Let us know if you are experiencing any tech issues. Okay, I'm now going to introduce our speaker for today, Allisyn Swift. She is the project director of NOLA Cares at Beloved Community. She brings with her over 20 years of experience working with children and families. Dr. Swift uses a human-centered, anti-racist, and trauma-informed approach to support organizational change towards equitable and anti-racist practices. Her research interests include the use of participatory action research to study the effects of race-based interpersonal and systemic stress on child socialization and parenting practices, advocacy for child-centered anti-racist approaches to education, and professional development to enhance the cultural and social emotional competence for teachers. She has also authored several book chapters and professional articles. Dr. Swift has spoken and done a presentation with us before, and so we are so excited to welcome her for another round of presentation. So thank you, Dr. Swift, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, I am going to share my screen. Hi, welcome. So I need to update my bio. I am no longer with Beloved Community. I am now a year and a half in at the Coalition for Compassionate Schools. It's a program at the psychology department at Tulane University. And it is where I am now. And we do a lot of different services in schools in New Orleans. We're also a Category 2 center with NCTSN. And yeah, so that's what I am doing now. So I'm going to hop in. Today, we are going to be talking about cultural humility and trauma-informed care. And so just a couple of things about what I kind of thought about when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about here. One thing is that when we talk about cultural humility and trauma-informed care is to think that we use the term cultural humility to indicate that there is no end to what we can learn and know about each other when we're talking about folks in different cultures, including our own culture, right? So this is going to hopefully give you a lot to think about, and maybe you might come away with more questions than you will actual concrete answers. And that's actually the point of cultural humility, right? That we're always getting smarter about how to work with different people, and that there is no one way to do it. And really, it has to do with, learning more and being open to learning more as you go along. So I just wanted to say that there. Um, Another thing that I wanted to do was just give a little bit of a disclaimer because of the climate that we're currently in. I feel compelled to just say that the ideas that are in this presentation are the informed professional opinions of the Coalition for Compassionate Schools, of which I'm the executive director, and they may not reflect the opinions or beliefs of Tulane University, who is the university that we're housed in. So first, a little bit about us, the Coalition for Compassionate Schools. There's a little QR code there that you can click on. Just give you a little introduction to who we are. Our acronym is CFORCE, the Coalition for Compassionate Schools. So this is our coalition. We are a group of folks that come from government agencies, nonprofits and universities, researchers and practitioners. And we are doing what I like to call deeper dives into different schools, working really with the smaller school community over a long period of time. And we also do a lot of training and consultation with different schools and also school-facing organizations. And we're branching out more and more to do more in our community as well and try to touch all of the places that touch kids. So these are who we are. These are CFORCE and who I like to call our play cousins. Our play cousins are people that are part of our coalition that are not CFORCE staff, but that have been very deeply in this work since its inception. And so these are just some of the faces that represent our organization in various capacities. So very simply, our vision is to have flourishing school systems that are rooted in community, healing, and human-centered approaches. And so what we really mean when we talk about the healing and the human-centered approaches is the ways in which we can envision getting past just coping into healing. A lot of the strategies that folks talk about now is how to cope with trauma and traumatic stress. And we want to envision getting beyond just coping into getting to the space where we're actually healing from trauma and then can encourage that healing to different community members and even to those outside of our communities and throughout our country. So our mission is to build the capacity of schools, students, and parents to create transformative change in education through the adoption, implementation, and sustainment of trauma-informed healing center practices. So one thing I really want to double down on here that we believe very strongly in is that we believe in really building the capacity of the community to be able to heal themselves. We believe deeply that the community has the answers that it needs when given the time, space, and resources to come up with their own healing practices and to also be able to access the healing practices that are already existing within their communities. So I just wanted to bring that into the space as well. So this is what we do. We have been coming together for over 8 years. We have a range of experts in mental and behavioral and public health. We coordinate our services with our school partners. We create programs that are focused on prevention, screening, and intervention. At the current moment, this list here are things that we are actively doing right now. Trauma-informed multi-tiered systems of support, universal behavioral and health screening, professional development, participatory action research, both for youth and now we're branching into parents and of course, trauma stewardship for educators under our education well-being. These are some of the things that we double down on here. Our 3 buckets are implementation support, research and evaluation, and collaboration and coordination. And again, our aim is to really create scalable and sustainable models for culturally responsive trauma-informed schools for transformative change in education locally and nationally. And so since we are talking about cultural humility here and the different ways of working, with different cultures and with different folks in general, when we say scalable and sustainable, it has to always begin with the community themselves being involved. That is the only way things can be sustainable. A lot of times we get a shiny new thing, but we're not able to hold on to that shiny new thing when it comes to programming because it was something that was never embedded in the community in the first place. So I just wanted to double down on some of those as our guiding principles of being sustainable, of being culturally responsive, and of really thinking about healing. Okay, so a little bit of our guiding trauma-informed frameworks, and these are things that are very close to our practice. We bring them in all the time. So of course, the first one is something that everyone is really familiar with, right? SAMHSA's 6 key principles. We have empowerment, voice and choice, peer support, trust and transparency, collaboration and mutuality. And then on that top bar there, you'll see educational equity. And on the bottom, you'll see cultural humility, because we really feel that those are the two things that are going to undergird and that are going to be interconnected and really form the basis of doing all of the other 4 principles. In the center there, you'll see dignity, agency, safety, and belonging, which are our 4 core components of being trauma-informed. And they have to really double down on our definition that we're going to get to in a moment, our unique definition of trauma. So something else that you might be familiar with are the 4 R's, which go alongside SAMHSA's 6 principles. And we're going to be really thinking about how we are doing all of these in a culturally informed and culturally reflective and culturally humiliative way. So the 4 R's: realize the prevalence and impact of trauma, recognizing the signs and needs of support, responding to promote individual and collective healing, and resisting re-traumatization. And they snuck that like 5th R in there, but it's okay. We're going to call it the 4 R's anyway. Resist re-traumatization by using trauma-informed principles in the classroom and school and in our communities. So this gets us to our definition of trauma. And I'm going to pause here and see how my interpreter is doing, if I'm going too fast or too slow.
You're good.
We're good. Okay. My mother is a American Sign Language interpreter, and so I always have to remember to reflect back on them and see, are they doing okay? Am I going too fast? Sometimes we just ramble on and we're not conscious of that. So, okay. So I'm going to move on now with what is trauma. This is our definition of trauma, and it's one that's very close to my heart. We identify trauma as the harmful interruption of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. Again, those 4 core components. What I find really compelling about this definition that was created by our former program director, Teddy McLean Wright, is that this definition is one of the only ones that I found that actually may point to the healing components from trauma. So if we're saying that the harmful interruption of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging is what happens to impact trauma and cause traumatic stress ongoing, then by restoring safety, agency, dignity, or belonging can give us a pathway to healing. And also programs that give a community a sense of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging are the preventative strategies that we could think about using. So we lean on this definition, and we lean on those 4 core components in a lot of different ways to inform how we are doing our work. So we also know that there are different things about trauma that this definition can also dial in on, right? So it's embodied at multiple levels: individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and historical, right? And on the individual level, we're talking about interpersonal trauma, trauma that happens to an individual alone, that they are the burden of. And I will say that that in and of itself is a Western cultural view. there are different cultures which also see trauma that happens to the individual. There is no thing that can happen to an individual that what impacts that individual is impacting the community. So I do just want to name that as well, that when the individual is going something, usually the family then is going through something. If that family is connected to a larger community and is really tied into it, then that means that community is also going to be experiencing some things with it. So there are ripple effects to thinking about it even happening at the individual level. So I do want to name that. Trauma can also be collective, something that a group of people experience at the same time. It can be systemic, traumas that are built into systems that are unavoidable for people that are the folks that have to endure those systems. Intergenerational, there's a lot of epigenetic studies now that show that how we literally can carry trauma in our bodies and can pass it down in generations if it goes uninterrupted through healing mechanisms and prevention. And historical, there can be trauma that has happened in the past that still comes up, that is still can be evoked in different ways in current capacities. So trauma can be acute, it can be chronic, it can be cumulative, and it can be complex. So just a little bit here, I'm sure that you are familiar with this, but I just want to give you our own spin on it. Of course, when we say acute, we mean that this is a one instance that happened, one car accident, one violent event, one event that happens in your life that gives you that harmful interruption of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging that would still be ongoing and affecting you if not intervened upon or healed upon, right? Then it could be chronic, right? Things that are ongoing, that happen, that are continuing throughout someone's developmental stage or lifespan, chronic trauma. Cumulative, things that build one on top of the other, right? Things that may start as something small, but because of your interaction with that trauma, it is now causing some other issues. And so things are kind of compounding one on top of the other. And it could be complex, which is similar to cumulative, but it's what complex is more about when the traumas are coming from different angles. So say that you are a person that inhabits multiple personalities, you might have experienced individual trauma, you might be experiencing collective trauma, systemic trauma, intergenerational trauma, and or historical trauma all at the same time. So that's the complex trauma. And that's the difference between complex trauma and cumulative trauma. Cumulative trauma is one thing, building on top of the other. Complex is when it's coming from different areas. And last, the thing that crosses over into just being a stressful event or just being something that happens that is easily overcome is that if it is trauma or ongoing traumatic stress, it's going to overwhelm our ability to cope with or to integrate our experience of that event or the ongoing events or the complexity of our events, right? So it overwhelms our experience to even cope with it. And if we can't really cope with it, then we can't really heal from it. Okay. So just some working definitions of what we mean when we say safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. So we see safety as the sense of being physically, psychologically, and emotionally secure. Agency as the ability to make decisions, experience reasonable consequences of those decisions, and then be able to make a subsequent decision, right? So being able to be a decision maker in your own body, to be able to be your own agent. And then there's dignity. Dignity is the sense of one's place and power in the world, the sense that you have power, your self-worth. And then there's belonging, the expression of being connected and being a full member of a group. So this is kind of how we see that our four core components, the safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, really overlap. They do not replace trauma, Sam's 6 principles of trauma, right? There's so much connection between all of them. But at the core of it all is safety, right? That is why safety comes first in our definition, right? If there's disrupted safety, then there is a very, very hard time to develop agency. If you cannot develop agency and have control over your own choices, that's going to inhibit your ability to have dignity, a sense of self-worth. And all of that, we hear the statement, if you can't love yourself, you can't love others. And that sounds very pat, but the truth of it is, if you don't have that internal sense of dignity and your sense of self-worth, it is very hard to know where you belong. And that sense of belonging is hard. So these build on another, on one on top of the other, but also safety is the core of all of these things. How are we keeping our communities safe, right? And the SAMHSA 6 principles are mostly the how of to do that. Are we doing our programs with trust and transparency? Are we being culturally humiliative? Are we really fighting for educational equity? And what does that really mean to us? Are we collaborating with our communities that we're working with? Do we help them develop their own agency and dignity and art and use and foster their already existing agency and dignity by allowing them to teach each other through peer support and learning, and thus giving them that empowerment, voice, and choice? So it's really that SAMHSA outlines the how, and we kind of outline the what. Okay, so when we talk about the 4 Rs and the harmful disruption of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, we really start to think about programs that can respond and resist re-traumatization by focusing on that restoration, creation, or fostering of already existing safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. So when we, think about how our model works with the 4 Rs, we look at the restoring safety. When you can identify with folks and actually just realize what the prevalence and the impact of trauma is in their community, right away, you are restoring some bit of safety, right? You're relieving some of the, gaslighting that may have happened at some point where people have been told that they are not dealing with trauma, right? That this is something that they as an individual have to hold, that this is not really happening, right? So just by realizing the prevalence and impact of trauma in a community can help to restore safety, right? And then we can restore safety and dignity by recognizing the signs of trauma and needs of support. So if I'm recognizing someone's behavior as a traumatic response, right? And not just as there's something wrong with that person, what's going on with them, they're a little shady over there. No, but I'm realizing that all of those behavioral components are actually signs of traumatic stress or trauma, and it's how they are expressing it. That is recognizing, that's recognition. And then responding by actually having programming and interactions to restore that safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, and digging into the collective healing will lead us to ways to resist traumatization by realizing that we can have those programs, but we also need policies, right, that are going to restore that safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. Okay, so what is culture and why is culture important to what we're talking about? So some of you have seen this before, right? It's the cultural iceberg, right? So we talk about like that big C culture and that little C culture. And so that big C culture, that's the things that we can visually see, right? That's the art, the music, the dance, the language, the food, how people dress themselves, the holidays that they celebrate, the sports that they do and that they uphold, right? Those are those big C things that we're thinking about culture. But then underneath the surface, there's a whole lot. There's a lot more underneath the surface than what we're seeing, right? This gets down to what is really deeply held by people. What are the social norms for communication? The treatments of children and elders, gender expression, right? All of those things are some of the deep culture. What are the verbal and the nonverbal symbols that are used to communicate? So those are the deeper cultural things. So alongside this big C and little c, another graphic and ideation around this idea of culture that I really love is one that was created by Zaretta Hammonds and Yvette Jackson. This levels of culture in terms of how they are really affecting us as people and the deep levels that it can really go through in terms of the emotional charge that certain things can cause, right? So that surface, the leaves, that what we can actually see, what's on top, as they say, right? That is kind of low emotional charge, right? You don't like the same music I like. All right, fine. You might dress differently. All right, fine. I celebrate this holiday. You celebrate that one. All right. You don't put enough hot sauce in your food. That's on you, right? That's observable, low emotional charge. That's not really going to cause a lot of like disruption in how we do. Unfortunately, a lot of times, though, this is where our cultural competence exercises rest. I just want to get to know them. I want to know about their music. I want to know about what food they eat, how they dress, their holidays, right? A lot of times things kind of stop there at that surface and we never go deeper. But then we're kind of just sitting on those things that have that low emotional charge that really might not make a difference in our relationships or in our ways of trying to impact the community in any way. So we go down through another level, right? The shallow level, the trunk of the tree. It's visible, right? But it's giving you that stronger emotional charge, right? Nonverbal communication, eye contact, personal space. What does that mean to different people in different ways? How are they actually communicating these things nonverbally? There's a lot that's there. And a lot of times we rely on other people to tell us these things rather than just asking. And you can find out a lot by just asking about things like personal space. Is it okay that I'm this close? Should I make distance? I always tell people sometimes, we're a very huggy family. I'm leaning and I'm like, I'm a hugger. If that's not cool, let me know. I'm going to back off. Right. So these unspoken rules and social norms, these are the ones that sometimes we assume that we may know about, but we don't really know until we ask. Asking's fine. And then there's the ones that are deeper, right? The ones that will cause the intense emotional charge, right? So there's that strong emotional charge where like somebody's too close, I'll back away. Somebody is giving too intense eye contact, I'll turn down. Something is activated in my system that tells me this isn't right. It doesn't feel comfortable. That's a strong emotional charge. But these other things, the deep roots, the things that we can't see, those things that really model our core beliefs as a people, those are what causes the intense emotional charge. And that's very important when we're talking about how to work with trauma with individuals and communities, because if we're not aligned or at least coming to an understanding and respect of what those core beliefs are, those group values, how they deal with things, collective versus individual, and even what that means within that, right? There are certain communities that are very collective and work things out together, but that's internal to them. They're not really ready for outsiders to come in and share that collective experience, right? So even then, there are nuances that we need to sit back and observe and ask questions about, right? And then mental models, funds of knowledge, mental schemas about what their world is, what is going on around them, how they're processing things, right? Those are the intense emotional charges. So those are the things that we're really working on when we're working through, cultural humility with our own learning, is how are we tapping into making meaning of, observing, coming into question, thinking about things on these levels of emotionality and how they really can impact people. So again, why is this important? Why is it important for our work? For thinking about things on an organizational level, I work mainly with students and families, so this is oriented that way. So we are thinking about this as in terms of how do we create a sense of belonging for students and families. If we are so misaligned with our students and families or with your population of interest that you're hitting on this, intense emotional charge all the time and not knowing it, you're not going to have people that feel like they belong, right? So it's very important. This awareness that we need to have to combat unintentional perpetuation of systems of oppression, right? Automatically guessing that a certain thing about a certain people, or they're because they present in a certain way that they uphold a certain belief, right? We're unintentionally perpetuating stereotypes sometimes, and those stereotypes create these systems of oppression, and it's iterative. Sometimes the system of oppression create the stereotypes, right? But that deteriorates a community's agency and dignity because we're not really seeing them, right? We're seeing something that is made up in our head that we're placing our biases on them, right? And so that's going to decrease that sense of safety, and that's going to put them out of belonging, right? It's important to be strength-based so that we can foster that agency. If we come in knowing all the answers, then how are we leaving space for the community to give their own answers and heal themselves? How are we fostering agency? If we're coming in with all of our assumptions because we've read all the papers and we've read all the books, how is that really telling us about this individual and how they operate, right? So this one, oh, it cut out the little citation on the bottom. But anyway, hopefully we'll get this PowerPoint out to you so you can see it all. But there's a quote that says, to ignore the reality of the existence of the influence of culture and to be unresponsive to the needs of the target population is to put the program in danger of being ineffective, and to put the evaluation, I put in academic or behavioral, in danger of being seriously flawed. So if we don't even know what the cultural context is, then we don't even know what the challenges that we're identifying. So we're making up all these preventative and, intervention activities that do not apply. And then at the end of it, we wonder why it hasn't really taken, right? So it's seriously flawed from the beginning if we have not been really responsive to the needs. And how do we know those needs without really engaging with our population? Right. And I will say, I don't like to use violent language. So they use target population. I like to say community of interest. I don't like to see people or populations as targets. But that's a direct quote. Okay, so we're going to go through each of the R's and really talk about this in a cultural humility, kind of lens. We're going to put that on right now, right? So the R, right? Realizing the impact of trauma in the community of interest. So what is the community that you're engaging in, and do you really know what they are dealing with? What does the data say, but what do the individuals say? What does the community say about what they're dealing with? So when we think about that, I think about prevalent issues that are in my community that I work with mostly, right? So I know that prevalent issues in my community are systemic, right? The mass incarceration that is disproportionate in the Black and Brown communities that I work in, over policed neighborhoods that can be, very trauma cueing, gentrification that have put people outside of their homes and ability to afford a living here in New Orleans, intergenerational poverty ongoing, maternal stress and depression, probably due to a lot of these systemic things, right? We have a higher rate of maternal stress and depression, violence exposure in our neighborhoods. Again, a lot of this due to a lot of these systemic things that are going on, child abuse and neglect. Again, the impact that it has on maternal stress and depression from all of these systemic things filtering down, right? Filtering down the environmental and neurological effects on learning. When we're talking about, environmental racism, plants that are built too close to where children play, not having access to clean air, clean water. There's a lot going on right now in the outside community in Memphis, where they have built a plant that is now really impacting that community's ability to breathe. And then this is all leading to really big outcomes. So in New Orleans, there's an income-based health disparity, a 20-year life expectancy gap between the richest and the poorest New Orleanians. 20 years, that's saying a lot. And we know because of the historical context, a lot of this income-based health disparity is also going to be linked to, race in some way, right? It's going to be connected to that life expectancy that we see. So specific to race-based traumatic stress, and this is what I'm conveying, not only a member of the Black community, but also as someone that works very deeply with the community, and we talk about these things internally all the time. We talk about these mental health these mental health disparities because we really think about how these disparities are causing this traumatic stress, and we know about what the trauma can do to you and your ability to have agency, your ability to motivate, move forward, things like that. And how these things are iterative, right? So these things are really affecting mental health of communities and are contributing to factors that the system is kind of doing where it can like run on its own, right? So there's studies that have shown that compared to income matched whites, so it's not income and it's not education, right? We always say, well, maybe they need to be better educated or maybe they need to make more money and that'll get people to a better place mental health wise, maybe. But compared to income matched whites, Black children have a daily higher base rate of cortisol. And in general, we exhibit a cortisol pattern that's been consistent with the profile of people who experience chronic stress or have been diagnosed with PTSD. So we can argue about whether or not some things that are happening in the system is real, but it's happening in our bodies, so that makes it real. So on average, we will express more symptoms of depression and more stress accumulation over time, right? So we really believe that in order to be trauma informed, we have to be culturally informed. You have to know the culture and the context of the people that you are working with. And this part of the presentation, I am talking about race. I am talking specifically about the disparities, but race is not just culture, right? So we're also going to talk about folks from the LGBTQ community, and we're also going to talk about different communities in general. So this is our context again, right? And so this is what we need to think about when we're talking about our context in terms of like trauma exposure and what kids are dealing with and how that impacts educator mental health. So this comes from a study that was done in 2021, and we all know what was going on in 2021 in terms of the COVID virus. So all of those things were impacting, right? But we see that this ongoing here, this is data from 2016. A lot of these data are still very valid. And we also think about the impact of being part of an ALICE household. For those of you that are not familiar with ALICE, ALICE stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained but Employed, right? So these are folks that are having 2, 3 jobs, but so they're probably earning a little bit more than the federal poverty level, but they still cannot afford basic necessities. And that's where that, compounded, trauma coming from gentrification, this is where it kind of leads to, right? These ALICE households. And for the folks that have to work with this community, we're seeing, folks that are part of the community that are also working with the community, we see a lot of depression, anxiety, 19% pointed to PTSD. It's really hard. So then we're having people that are impacted by trauma themselves working with a community that is impacted with trauma, right? And so there's a lot more of this information here about the student prevalence, about what people were experiencing. And I point this out to talk about when we are talking about communities, right? And this is again when I'm saying that communities are not just racial. We experience the collective trauma as a city and as a nation. This is the collective trauma that we had during COVID, right? And this is national. So this is our national community experiencing a trauma together. One that I can argue that we have never really dealt with. There has never been an outcoming, a healing process to transition from what happened during COVID. We just, the next day, business as usual, things are opening up, let's get back out there, right? And so I think that in some way, the way that we are seeing still a lot of depression in our adolescents and our young people and stress in adults may be tied to our ways that we did not really cope or deal with or heal at all from this experience, this collective experience of trauma. So we're going to go to recognize, right? So we talked about realize, we talked about all of those stats. We saw the prevalence of it everywhere, right? So now recognizing, how do we recognize the signs and the behaviors of trauma? How do we recognize those signs as needs for support? So Resmaa Menakem, he's the author of My Grandmother's Hands. He's an LCSW. He's an extremely skilled facilitator. And one quote that I really love from him is that trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality. Oh, that person's really slow. That person has anger issues. That person, whatever, fill in the blank, right? It starts to look like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family looks like family traits. Oh, those people, they're really insular. They don't like to let you go on sleepovers. They don't, seem very argumentative, right? Family traits. Trauma decontextualized in a people looks like culture. Thinking about inside culture versus outside, right? We have to keep this close to ourselves. The they, them, they, outsider, and us. That's the cultural divide, right? that was built up. That was probably meant to serve something in some way for a culture, right? But it got decontextualized over time. And so one statistic that I look at to kind of talk about at least how behaviors can really be linked to trauma. And if we're not thinking about, if we don't recognize the foundations, the roots of those behaviors, we're then making practices and policies that may not be really working towards what we want to see in that behavior. So for example, the statistic with ACEs and adult smoking, so individual who reported exposure to 5 or more ACEs are 5 times as likely to initiate smoking at an early age and 3 times as likely to smoke heavily, right? So if we start to think about chronic smoking as a trauma response, instead of there's something wrong with those people, we need to kick them down to the end of the block, we got to take away all the ashtrays, we got to make the cigarette prices higher and do all of those things, which, can be effective too. What if we just focused on childhood trauma and eliminating it and then see what happens to people's health over time, right? So again, if we're not recognizing some of the things that are happening within communities as signs of trauma response, and then we just think about it as personality or traits or culture, then we're missing the point of where we can intervene. So I encourage you to look within the communities that you work with. Look into your own community. I would say always start there before you start looking at other people like don't have a culture. Look at your own, right? What are some of the things that we're doing? What are some of the things that we've created in our culture that are trauma responses that we are constantly doing and responding to all the time? And how can we really work through those things? Okay, next, we're going to talk about responding, right? And so when I talk about responding, again, I spoke about, moving from coping to healing, right? Cigarette smoking is a coping practice. It's not going to help heal from the experience that folks had, right? It's going to help you cope in the moment. Sometimes it's the deep breath. There's a lot of wisdom in our vices. Again, Resmaa Menakem said that. What is it that we're seeking when we're coping? And I'm not ditching coping. Like, coping is great. Taking that bubble bath when you need it, getting your nails done, you need it. That's the coping, right? That helps you feel good in the moment. And that is to be valued. Anything that gives people space for rest and comfort is wonderful and should be upheld. However, you get out of the bathtub, you finish your nails, what you're dealing with internally is still there. And that's the difference between coping and healing. Healing is the ongoing practice of taking care of the mechanisms that are within us to be able to move forward, while coping can be very temporary and it's not going to take you past that, right? So what strengths are we drawing on in the community to really foster that agency, dignity, and belonging? What healing practices already exist, right? And so when we talk about healing centered, it asserts that trauma is systemic and collective as well as individual, which means that it calls for action in addressing environmental context that causes these trauma, right? What's kind of causing these cumulative and complex traumas that's ongoing, right? We're trying to fix the people instead of the systems. And I argue that we need to do both, right? Or else we're just going to keep repeating the things, or at least help the folks that are experiencing a thing find their agency to be able to get to a better place themselves, right? So it's asset and it's strength based. Again, what are the strengths that we're drawing on within the community? And it views those that have experienced trauma as agents in their own well-being rather than victim, right? So it takes the attention off of they're a victim of the system, they're a victim of this, they're a victim of that, to what are the agencies that people have been showing for generations and generations, and how do we have those come forth even more, right? And so it actively utilizes culture and what exists within the culture and cultural practices as a pathway toward meaning making and healing. And so the last one is the resisting re-traumatization through actions, right? Inclusive prevention and intervention. So what are the healing practices exist? What strengths are we drawing on? How are we doing this? How are we moving towards resisting re-traumatization by really making sure that folks are in a better place in terms of their agency and their dignity and their belonging? And so when we say that, we're thinking about the whole concept of doing things with and not to. As a researcher, as a practitioner, whatever you're doing, how are you involving the community in all of these pieces and defining the challenge? And again, I say not problem, but challenge, right? Problems kind of have a period on the end of it. Challenges, again, give people a space to find agency, to move towards something, right? How are we involving the community of interest in defining the intervention? How are we involving them in ongoing evaluation and defining, like, okay, this is our intervention. What does it look like on the other side of this? What does healing look like? All right, let's make that one of the points that we're going to be evaluating, how we're getting closer to that healing. And then how are we involving them in preventative strategies? So I'm going to offer this here. You can get it off of the IAP website, the International Association of Public Participation. And I put this here because a lot of times we say, oh, we're involving the community, we're involving the public and things. But I think that we need to be, again, have that trust and transparency, trustworthiness and transparency. Where are we involving people and when, right? Being very clear with your populations will also help them feel like get that sense of safety, but also that sense of uh, agency, right? And dignity, right? I know where I fit in. I know where I'm going to work. I know when I'm just being informed, instead of people saying that we're empowering the community to do something when really we're just kind of consulting and involving them on some level, right? So I love this. I try to use this as much as possible. And I think that we should also name that there are some times when it is appropriate, depending on what is happening at the moment. This is not a judgment, right? Sometimes informing is appropriate. Sometimes consulting is appropriate, right? But just to be clear with where you are and what you're doing. So one thing that I like to think about too is the concept of post-traumatic growth, which I know that many of you on this call know about already. Tedeschi and Calhoun kind of coined this back in 2004. And it's really the idea that people heal and learn from their trauma, right? So and usually that comes with, in the moment of the stress, at the moment of the trauma, there was some way that they connected to agency, dignity, and belonging that was able to give them the healing that leads to post-traumatic growth. So this is a quote here by a beautiful qualitative study that was made, I think it was 2024, and they interviewed a lot of elder gay men that lived through the AIDS epidemic, which was a massive trauma that was being, ignored by the government on a lot of levels. People were left to try to figure out their own ways of healing, and then were basically demonized and told that it's their fault that this was happening to their community. But the post-traumatic growth here that happened is that they really were able to bond and join together even more of a community. And really, one of the findings of this study was that they started to really think about how they care about themselves even more, and how their community can really heal themselves, right? And so one of my favorite parts of this quote is, that's what healing is, when systems and organisms are free to be all of themselves, free to fulfill their role and their function and their purpose, right? That's agency and dignity right there. That leads to belonging. He says it right here in this quote, all of these things, all of those things that they talked about. That is the power and the strength of the community being able to find that agency and that dignity that can lead them out of the way. So I think that one of the biggest headlines here, again, is that there are no hard, fast answers to how to work with different communities and how to find your way. It really is about how we are, as researchers, as practitioners, as program leaders, how are we really helping communities by giving them the resources and the space and the time that they need so that they can actuate their own healing mechanisms? So This is a slide that I showed when I was here last time. I added a little graphic to make it a little different. But who you are matters, right? Who we are in this space really matters. How people are viewing us matters. We have to think of ourselves as cultural bodies as much as we think of the population of interest or the parents that we work with or the kids we work with and getting to know them, right? We have to be really socially aware to be able to build that trust and transparency, right? And that social awareness, that's when you're accurately assessing the social climate and infer reaction. You are a person in this, right? So they're going to be reacting to you and you're going to be reacting to them, and being socially aware of some things as these interactions are happening and asking yourself some questions will really help to mitigate, right? What is the perception of your organization in the population of interest? Does your even if your organization is doing better now, have they been historically harmful to this population of interest, right? What is your relationship to the sector that you're trying to address, right? Whether that's the medical sector, what are your experiences there? How does that differ from your community of interest experiences there, educational, and so on and so forth? What is your program's track record? What have you actually done in the community that they should respect you just because you came in to ask questions, right? How does your message address the public perception and match the current intention? So if you may have come from a place of harm and you're not addressing that, or you come from a community that outwardly perceived on your body seems similar to a community that may have caused harm to these people, are you addressing that? And are you addressing your current intentions? Or are we just going to gloss over it, right? And act like it doesn't happen? And again, building that trust, right? And then how do your current actions, what are you doing right now, increase safety to build confidence that you are a safe person, right? That your organization are safe to interact with, that this program is going to be something that is healing and not extractive in the community. So think about these questions here. And speaking of questions, that's it. We've got about 8 more minutes for your questions. And so, yeah, I think I'm gonna, can I turn off I think I'm gonna stop sharing right now. And we'll just see who's in the room. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Swift, for that amazing presentation. We're going to start fielding some questions now. So we have about 8 minutes left. So if you guys have any questions or comments for Dr. Swift, please put them in the Q&A box um, down below, and we'll start answering and addressing.
I can't see your question, so hopefully you're asking them.
None have popped up yet, but oh, I lied. One is up. Let's see. It says workplaces can be a place of opportunity for cultural humility, but employees often have to depart from their own culture to conform to the transactional nature of an office culture. How can we apply cultural humility daily to the workplace environment and have more experiences of culture that go below the line or beneath the superficial level observations and transactions to continue learning about culture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's when that's really complex, because one thing that I'm very careful of doing is making people that are not, that don't have agency, right, that are not the leaders of an organization, be responsible for leading that organization into deeper cultural humility, right? So I would say this is more of a question for the leaders in the workplace than it is for you. One thing that at the past organization I worked with, we intentionally shifted from working with just teachers to working with school leaders, because what was happening is that the teachers would try to do these practices, and then it was then enculturated into the culture of the place where they were. So they were, deeply frustrated. Again, that actually goes to take away from your sense of dignity, your sense of self-worth, when you're constantly trying to fight something. So I would say for you that you can embark on your own individual journey And at the same time, you can have conversations with your leaders if you feel that you are in a place that is safe for you to do so. But I will be honest that an individual can only do so much in changing an organization unless the leadership is aligned. And so I don't want to give advice on like what your leaders can do if they are not in the room to receive it, because you should not be in that position to be that middle person. I'm sorry, that doesn't really quite answer your question, but I think that you are on the right path by even asking these questions and by recognizing what is happening. And I think that to the capacity that you have with the people that you work and interact with, you keep working on that. And in the places that you feel safe enough to, influencing and educating others.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Swift. We have another question that asks, do we have an organization in Lafayette who works with our public schools? Dr. Swift, I don't think you're not from the Lafayette area, are you? So I'm not sure if you would
No,
have an
we
answer
work.
to this question.
Can you say the question again? Are they asking if
Um,
we work in Lafayette or
no, if there's an organization in Lafayette who works with our public schools, kind of like how
how we
your
work in schools
organization
here?
does. Hmm.
So we do work, to our capacity, both statewide and nationally. I don't know of organizations specifically in Lafayette. I know that folks from the Lafayette School Board have actually reached out to us for some consultation, and so some consultation has been happening there. So I can say that. But yes, we work with all folks on a consultation level. Yeah.
We have another question that asks, a common critique of trauma-informed care as well as practicing cultural humility is that it is difficult to gauge the effectiveness of programs that center these concepts as their focus. What metrics do you all use to monitor the effectiveness of your philosophies in practice? Are there specific ones for the concepts, or is the idea to monitor the health of a community as a whole and use that as the bar for success or failure of a policy?
Right. I love this question. So the answer is yes, both. So we are actually refining our tool that we are using. So we use a couple of different walkthrough tools, and we actually have a policies and practice tool that goes through the different dimensions, and cultural humility is one of them. And so as folks are measured on this, they get a chance to pick one or two things that they can actually work on, right? This is ongoing change, right? This is ongoing. So we don't want people to feel like they have to fix everything at once, because that's not reasonable or sustainable. But yes, we do have tools. I think that most of our tools are posted on our website, but we are in the midst right now of refining them based on feedback and based on data that we've collected already. There are also different places that offer equity audits. The organization I used to be in, Beloved Community, I think that they have, I think their website, AWA, is still up, where you can take a free equity audit. And that will lead you to it's really for organizations or schools to do themselves. And then with some consultation, you can come to some conclusions, but there are some measures out there.
Can you drop the links to those websites in the chat for us, Dr. Swift, so we can share them with the audience if anyone is interested in checking those websites and toolkits out?
Okay, so that's my website there. And then I think that that's the one that Beloved has. Yeah. And also too, remember, one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that we should really be asking the community on what measures that they would like to see moved. So yes, and that is part of the work, right? Like, yes, we have our own. What are some things, if you're talking about specific programs and like how to measure that within a specific program, I think that asking your population of interest and including them in that is really where to start.
Yes, thank you for that note. I'm reading your bio. You said it said that you were very interested in participatory action research, and I think that's very important whenever we're thinking about cultural humility and trauma-informed care, because centering the community is part of that practice of cultural humility and trauma-informed care. So thank you for including that note as well. There's one last question that we'll answer because it is time. So this one says, Anna would like to have your contact information. They would like to get in touch with you about their school board members. So Dr. Swift, you can add that
Yeah,
your
sure.
contact information in the chat as well for
Yep.
anyone
So
who's interested.
if you go to the website, you'll see our contact there, but I'll put mine here. It's just very simple. You can either use Allisyn at cforce.org or A Swift at tulane.edu. I'll put both of them in there. They both speak to each other and route to each other. So if you use any one of those, I will get it.
Okay, awesome. Well, it is time, so I just want to thank you again for your presentation, and I would like to thank our interpreter, Lisa Gill, for again always interpreting. And again, if there's any questions you guys have, please let us know, and look out for our future and upcoming lunch and learns. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.